Welcome back to the behind-the-scenes stories from Reliving Mark, Discovering Jesus in Israel. I'm Cosaert, the writer and the host of the series. Two of my favorite behind-the-scenes stories from our entire filming experience in Israel are connected to episode 3. They involve a Syrian missile attack and a group of Jewish young people who met Jesus for the first time while acting in this episode. Episode 3 of Reliving Mark focuses on the story of Jesus and the healing of the paralytic in Mark chapter 2. To help make that story come alive for our viewers, we decided to film the scene in a wonderfully reconstructed historical Jewish village in Cosaert, a small Jewish community in the Golan Heights. As you see in episode 3, there's a reconstructed home in that village that illustrates what a house from the time of Jesus would have looked like. It's a great place to envision what would have happened when the crowd surrounded the house where Jesus was and where the paralytic was let down through the roof. We had received permission to film in Cosaert on Thursday, May 10, just a couple hours before the site opened up to the general public. While everything seemed to be going as planned, we had one potential problem, and it was huge. We were filming in the Golan Heights at a time when military tension between Syria and Israel was at an all-time high. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the geography of the Middle East, the Golan Heights is the region that borders Syria in northern Israel. Cosaert is just 10 miles away from the Syrian border and only 30 miles away from Damascus. The news media were certain that Iranian special military units were operating along the Syrian border with Israel, and that they were going to launch an attack of some sort, and soon. We just hoped that we could finish our filming in the Golan Heights before anything happened that might make it impossible for us to complete our work. We needed 3 days to do all our filming in the Golan Heights. Everything seemed to be going as scheduled on Tuesday, May 8, when we were in Gamla. But on Wednesday, we recognized everything wasn't quite right when we were in Canatier. Towards the end of the day, we could hear a distinctive buzzing and humming noise in the air. At first, we weren't sure what it really was, but eventually we figured it out. It was Israeli military drones that were flying back and forth, patrolling the area. As we left and headed back to where we were staying in Galilee, our suspicions that something was going to happen were confirmed as we saw that a heightened number of military vehicles had moved into the area. We didn't want to be in the Golan Heights when a war broke out, but we just needed to go back for one more day in the morning to finish up filming in Cosaert. Just before midnight, I was suddenly awakened by the sound of a loud explosion that shook my room. I quickly jumped out of bed and opened the curtains of the huge window that was in my bedroom. The night sky was lit up by a missile attack. I could see missiles being fired from Syria into the Golan Heights, and several of them being intercepted by the Israeli Iron Dome anti-missile battery. I could also see missiles being fired in return from the Golan Heights into Syria. After counting about 25 missiles, I texted my wife to let her know we were okay, and I went back to bed, trusting that the situation was in God's hands. When I got up in the morning, the whole situation seemed so surreal. The view from my window was beautiful. After checking the news, it looked like the situation might be over. So we decided to drive back to the Golan Heights. When we arrived at the historic village in Cosaert, there was no one there to let us in. After what had happened that night, they had figured that there was no way we were still coming in to film that morning. One of the ladies who works at the site told us that in the 20 years she's lived there, she had never been as afraid as she was that night before. All the residents in the region had received an emergency alert from the Israeli government, urging them to enter the secure, bomb-protective area of their homes and prepare for the worst. We later learned that every home in Israel has one of those secure, bomb-protective areas. We found ours when we got back to our house later that night, but of course by then it was too late. The situation, however, turned out to be a blessing to us. since we had Cosaert to ourselves for nearly the entire day. All the other tourist groups had canceled. Now let me tell you what happened with the Jewish actors who came to help us film that day in Cosaert. Aran, our logistics coordinator, had let the word get out that we were looking for actors to come and help us film in the Golan Heights. Since most adults couldn't take the time off from work to film for the day, we mostly had a bunch of young Jewish people contact us, and they were excited to get to be in a film. Since we ended up having more actors than we needed that day, Aran decided to call 2 Orthodox Jews who had volunteered to help us, but who lived 2.5 hours away in Jerusalem, to tell them not to come. They would have to get up really early that morning, find public transportation, and Aran simply thought it wasn't worth their hassle. Amir, however, our Jesus character, who I'll talk about in a later episode, said, "No, let them come. They're Orthodox Jews. This might be their only opportunity to experience something like this and to hear about Jesus." And sure enough, missile attack the night before notwithstanding, everyone who'd signed up to be part of the episode that day showed up. And boy, were they excited. They had a fun time dressing up in biblical costumes, although some of the girls weren't too excited about us wanting them to cover their hair. Well, they did an amazing job that day with a little coaching and a few retakes. There was one scene, however, that they just struggled to get right. It was a scene based on Mark 2, verse 2, where it says, "And many were gathered together, so that there was no more room, not even at the door." To depict that on camera, we wanted the actors to crowd around one of the entrances and to do a little jostling around as they strained to look into the room to see Jesus. But as hard as we tried to coach them, they were just far too polite. No one wanted to be pushy. After multiple failed shots, we were just about ready to give up on the scene when Aran showed up and he asked us what was the problem. Once we explained the situation to him, he said, "Oh, I can solve that easily." We weren't so confident. We had really tried. But nevertheless, we thought we'd give Aran a chance. Aran called them all together, and in Hebrew he told them to imagine that it was late Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. Sundown was quickly approaching, and the Sabbath would soon begin. They were at a bus stop on their way home, and this was the last bus before the sunset. If they didn't get on this bus, they wouldn't make it home for Sabbath. We watched as their heads nodded in reply. And with that, Aran announced we were ready to start filming again. We were skeptical it would work, but amazingly it did. Those polite and cordial Jewish young people started pushing them and jostling each other just like we wanted. The most memorable experience from filming that day, however, took place with the scene inside the house with Jesus. In order to help our Jewish actors really get into character, we had to explain to them the story of Jesus and the paralytic, since none of them had ever heard the story before. Sure, they heard about Jesus, but only from a Jewish perspective. They had never heard the story of Jesus from the New Testament. Now, throughout the day, while we had to do a little coaching to help them know how to respond and what facial expressions were important, there was one scene where they didn't need any help. It was the shock they expressed when hearing Jesus tell the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." They were just as surprised as the Pharisees in the story. Who did Jesus think he was to be able to forgive the sins of the paralytic? We told them that the expression of surprise was just what we needed, and the question they asked was just the question they were supposed to ask. It is what Jesus does next, though, that makes the story far more surprising and even more amazing. In telling the paralytic his sins were forgiven, Jesus was claiming to have the same authority on earth that God has in heaven. We told them that if that's all that would have happened that day, people would have just said Jesus was crazy. His words meant nothing. But in healing the paralytic, Jesus demonstrated that his words were not just empty religious rhetoric. His words were filled with power. The words of Jesus have the power to heal and also to forgive human sin. The words of Jesus reveal his true identity. I'll never forget the powerful way we experienced the story of Jesus afresh with those Jewish young people. If we had allowed the missile attack the night before to have caused us to cancel our day in Cosaert, we would have missed out on a tremendous blessing. Next time I'll tell you two stories connected to episode 4, stories of a donkey and of a giant disciple. So I hope you can join me for that. Until then, take care and thanks for watching.